On June 13th, 2005, in a courtroom in Santa Maria, California, the jury foreman stood and read the verdicts in one of the most closely watched trials in modern history. Not guilty, not guilty, not guilty. 14 times, the words echoed through the room. Michael Jackson, accused of child molestation, conspiracy, and administering alcohol to a minor, had been acquitted on every single count. The reaction was immediate and divided. Outside the courthouse, fans erupted in celebration, convinced that justice had been served. Critics and some victims' advocates expressed outrage, believing that a guilty man had walked free. But what actually happened inside that courtroom? What evidence was presented? What did the jury see that led them to acquit? And what does the trial tell us about the American justice system, the nature of celebrity, and the difficulty of proving allegations of abuse? The answers are more complex than either side of the public debate would suggest. The case that led to the 2005 trial began in February 2003, when a documentary titled Living with Michael Jackson aired on British television. The documentary, produced by journalist Martin Bashir, featured extensive interviews with Jackson and showed him at his Neverland Ranch surrounded by children. In one particularly controversial segment, Jackson held hands with a 13-year-old boy named Gavin Arvizo, a cancer survivor whom Jackson had befriended. Jackson spoke openly about sharing his bed with children, insisting that it was innocent and that he was providing them with love and comfort. The footage sparked immediate concern. Within days, the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Department and the Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services launched investigations. By November 2003, Jackson's Neverland Ranch was raided by 70 police officers executing a search warrant. And in December 2003, Jackson was formally arrested and charged with multiple counts of child molestation and conspiracy. The alleged victim at the center of the case was Gavin Arvizo, a boy who had been diagnosed with cancer at a young age and had undergone extensive treatment. Jackson had met Gavin through a charitable organization and had invited him and his family to visit Neverland on several occasions. The Arvizo family stayed at the ranch for extended periods, and according to the prosecution, it was during these visits that Jackson allegedly molested Gavin. The charges were serious and specific. The prosecution alleged that Jackson had engaged in lewd acts with a child, that he had conspired with his associates to hold the Arvizo family against their will, and that he had provided Gavin with alcohol, which the prosecution described as a tool to lower the boy's inhibitions. If convicted on all counts, Jackson faced decades in prison. The lead prosecutor was Tom Sneddon, the district attorney of Santa Barbara County. Sneddon had a history with Jackson. He had been the prosecutor who investigated the 1993 allegations involving Jordan Chandler, a case that had ended with a civil settlement and no criminal charges. Many observers believed that Sneddon had been waiting for another opportunity to pursue Jackson, and the Arvizo case gave him that chance. Sneddon was aggressive in his approach, publicly announcing the charges and making statements that suggested confidence in his case. But from the beginning, there were signs that the prosecution faced significant challenges. The Arvizo family had a complicated history. The mother, Janet Arvizo, had previously been involved in legal disputes and had made allegations of abuse in other contexts. Defense attorneys would later argue that she had a pattern of making false claims for financial gain. The trial began on January 31st, 2005 at the Santa Barbara County Superior Court in Santa Maria. The media coverage was extraordinary. Hundreds of journalists from around the world descended on the small California town, turning the courthouse into a circus. Fans camped outside, holding signs and chanting Jackson's name. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Jackson arrived each day dressed impeccably, often in suits with military-style jackets and sunglasses. He was flanked by his legal team, led by Thomas Mesereau Jr., a renowned defense attorney known for his aggressive cross-examinations and his ability to dismantle prosecution witnesses. The jury, composed of 8 women and 4 men, sat quietly taking notes and watching as the case unfolded. The prosecution's strategy was to establish a pattern of behavior. They wanted to show that Jackson had a history of inappropriate relationships with young boys, that he used his wealth and fame to draw children into his inner circle at Neverland, and that he created an environment where misconduct could allegedly occur. To do this, they called a series of witnesses, including employees of Neverland Ranch, law enforcement officials, and other individuals who claimed to have knowledge of Jackson's behavior. They also attempted to introduce evidence from the 1993 case, arguing that it demonstrated a pattern. The judge allowed some of this evidence, including testimony connected to the 1993 accuser, though that individual did not testify in person. Instead, his allegations were presented through statements and reports. The prosecution's key witnesses were members of the Arvizo family. Gavin Arvizo himself took the stand, describing interactions he later characterized as inappropriate and deeply disturbing. He testified that boundaries were crossed on multiple occasions and that he was exposed to material and situations he said were not appropriate for a child. Gavin's testimony was emotional and, at times, compelling. He spoke softly, answering questions from the prosecutor with apparent difficulty, as if recalling traumatic events. His brother, Star Arvizo, also testified, claiming that he had witnessed behavior he believed supported the allegations. And their mother, Janet Arvizo, testified about the conspiracy charge, alleging that Jackson and his associates had held the family under undue control at Neverland, pressuring them to participate in a rebuttal video defending Jackson. But the defense team, led by Mesereau, immediately began to dismantle the credibility of these witnesses. During cross-examination, Mesereau revealed inconsistencies in Gavin's testimony. He pointed out that Gavin had previously told investigators, under oath, that Jackson had never acted inappropriately toward him. It was only later, after his mother had consulted with lawyers, that Gavin changed his account. Mesereau also highlighted the timeline of the alleged incidents, noting that they supposedly occurred after the Bashir documentary had aired, a time when Jackson was already under intense global scrutiny. The defense argued that this timeline made little sense, suggesting that Jackson would not have engaged in such behavior while under constant public observation. The cross-examination of Janet Arvizo was even more damaging to the prosecution. Mesereau revealed that Janet had a history of making false or exaggerated allegations. She had previously accused employees of a J.C. Penney store of assault, a case that had resulted in a settlement. She had also lied under oath in welfare fraud cases, claiming poverty while receiving financial support from Jackson and others. Mesereau presented evidence suggesting that Janet had coached her children to provide specific narratives and had encouraged statements that aligned with financial demands made against Jackson. He also showed that Janet had made contradictory statements about the alleged confinement at Neverland, at times describing it as imprisonment, and at other times acknowledging that the family had left the ranch on multiple occasions without restriction. The prosecution also called former Neverland employees who claimed to have witnessed inappropriate behavior. These witnesses testified that they had observed Jackson spending private time with young boys and that they had noticed patterns they considered troubling. But under cross-examination, many of these witnesses were shown to have credibility issues. Some had been fired from Neverland and had financial motives for testifying against Jackson. Others had sold their stories to tabloid magazines, raising questions about whether their testimony was motivated by money rather than truth. One particularly problematic witness was Ralph Chacon, a former security guard who testified that he had witnessed serious misconduct. Mesereau revealed that Chacon had previously sued Jackson for wrongful termination and had lost the case, with a judge ordering him to pay Jackson's legal fees. The implication was clear. Chacon had a motive to lie. The defense strategy was not only to attack the credibility of the prosecution's witnesses, but to present an alternative narrative. Mesereau argued that the Arvizo family had targeted Jackson as part of a coordinated attempt to extract money from him. He presented evidence that Janet Arvizo had a pattern of befriending celebrities and then making allegations in order to secure settlements. He showed that after the Bashir documentary aired, Jackson's advisors had become concerned about the Arvizo family and had tried to distance Jackson from them. The defense argued that the conspiracy charge was absurd, that the Arvizos were not being held captive, but were instead reluctant to leave because they were enjoying the privileges of staying at Neverland. The defense also called character witnesses who testified to Jackson's kindness and his genuine love for children. Macaulay Culkin, the former child actor who had been friends with Jackson, took the stand and testified that he had spent countless nights at Neverland and that Jackson had never behaved inappropriately. He described Jackson as a mentor and a friend, someone who treated him with respect and care. Other witnesses, including Brett Barnes, another young man who had stayed at Neverland, gave similar testimony. These witnesses were compelling because they had no apparent motive to lie. They were not being paid by Jackson, and they had voluntarily come forward to defend him. The issue of the shared bed was one of the most controversial aspects of the trial. The prosecution argued that Jackson's admission of sleeping in the same bed with children was, in itself, evidence of inappropriate behavior. But the defense countered that sharing a bed does not equal abuse, that Jackson's bedroom was enormous and that children often slept on the floor or in sleeping bags while Jackson slept in the bed. They argued that Jackson's openness about this practice was evidence of his innocence, that a guilty person would have hidden such behavior rather than discussing it openly on television. This argument was risky, as it required the jury to accept a highly unconventional lifestyle as harmless. But Mesereau framed it in the context of Jackson's unusual upbringing, his lack of a normal childhood, and his genuine belief that he was providing a safe and loving environment for children. The prosecution's case was further weakened by the testimony of forensic experts. Investigators had searched Neverland Ranch extensively, seizing computers, magazines, and other materials. They found adult magazines, some of which featured young-looking models, and they argued that these were used to groom children. But the defense pointed out that there was no child pornography found, no explicit images of children, and no evidence that Jackson had shown these materials to Gavin Arvizo or any other child. The fingerprint evidence was particularly damaging to the prosecution. Investigators claimed to have found Gavin's fingerprints on some of the adult magazines, suggesting that Jackson had shown them to the boy. But the defense argued that the fingerprints could have been planted or could have been left at a different time, and they pointed out that the magazines were readily accessible in Jackson's bedroom, meaning anyone could have touched them. The timeline of the alleged abuse was another major issue. The prosecution claimed that the abuse occurred in February and March of 2003, after the Bashir documentary had aired and after investigations had already begun. This timeline was problematic for several reasons. First, it required the jury to believe that Jackson would commit abuse at a time when he was under intense scrutiny. Second, there was evidence that the Arvizo family had left Neverland and had then returned voluntarily after the alleged abuse had supposedly occurred. The defense argued that this made no sense, that a mother who believed her child was being abused would not allow him to return to the abuser's home. The prosecution tried to explain this by arguing that Janet Arvizo was manipulated and controlled by Jackson, but the evidence of her leaving and returning on multiple occasions undermined that argument. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the prosecution's case was unraveling. The inconsistencies in the testimony, the credibility issues with the witnesses, and the lack of physical evidence were taking a toll. Legal analysts who were covering the trial began to predict that the prosecution would struggle to secure a conviction. Some suggested that Sneddon had overcharged the case, that he had included too many counts and had relied too heavily on questionable witnesses. Others pointed out that the defense had done an exceptional job of creating reasonable doubt, which is all that is required for an acquittal in a criminal trial. The closing arguments took place in early June 2005. Sneddon delivered a passionate closing statement, urging the jury to look past the celebrity and focus on the evidence. He argued that Jackson had used his fame and his wealth to manipulate the Arvizo family, that he had created an environment where abuse could occur, and that Gavin's testimony, despite the inconsistencies, was credible. He reminded the jury that children are often unreliable witnesses in abuse cases, not because they are lying, but because trauma affects memory. He asked the jury to consider the totality of the evidence and to hold Jackson accountable. Mesereau's closing argument was equally powerful but took a different approach. He systematically dismantled the prosecution's case pointing out every inconsistency, every credibility issue, and every piece of evidence that contradicted the allegations. He argued that the Arvizo family were con artists who had targeted Jackson, that they had coached their children to lie, and that the prosecution had built its case on a foundation of falsehoods. He reminded the jury of the presumption of innocence, of the requirement that the prosecution prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and he argued that the prosecution had failed to meet that burden. He ended by asking the jury to ignore the media circus, to ignore the public pressure, and to make their decision based solely on the evidence presented in the courtroom. The jury deliberated for 7 days. During that time, speculation was rampant. Some believed that the length of the deliberations indicated disagreement among jurors, that some wanted to convict while others wanted to acquit. Others suggested that the jury was simply being thorough, carefully reviewing the evidence before reaching a decision. On June 13, 2005, the jury announced that they had reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed. Jackson sat quietly, flanked by his family and his legal team. The jury foreman stood and began to read. Not guilty on count 1. Not guilty on count 2. Not guilty on count 3. The pattern continued through all 14 counts. Jackson showed little emotion, though his family members wept with relief. Outside the courthouse, the reaction was chaotic, with fans celebrating and critics expressing disbelief. In the days following the verdict, several jurors spoke to the media about their decision-making process. Their statements were revealing. Multiple jurors said that they had found the Arvizo family to be not credible. One juror described Janet Arvizo as wacky and said that her testimony had been so inconsistent that it was impossible to believe. Another juror said that they had considered the possibility that abuse had occurred, but that the prosecution had not proven it beyond a reasonable doubt. The jurors emphasized that their decision was based on the evidence, not on their feelings about Jackson or their opinions about whether he was innocent in a moral sense. They were clear that acquittal did not mean they believed Jackson was innocent. It meant they believed the prosecution had not met its burden of proof. The issue of reasonable doubt was central to the jury's decision. In the American legal system, a defendant does not have to prove innocence. The prosecution must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, a high standard designed to protect individuals from wrongful conviction. The jury in the Jackson trial found that the prosecution had not met that standard. The inconsistencies in the testimony, the credibility issues with the witnesses, and the lack of physical evidence all contributed to reasonable doubt. Some jurors later said that they believed Jackson's lifestyle was inappropriate, that his relationships with children were troubling, but that troubling behavior is not the same as criminal behavior. They distinguished between what they personally found acceptable and what they could prove in a court of law. The verdict was a devastating blow to Tom Sneddon and the prosecution. Sneddon, who had pursued Jackson for over a decade, was visibly shaken. In a press conference after the verdict, he defended his decision to bring the case to trial, arguing that he had a duty to investigate the allegations and to let a jury decide. But critics pointed out that the case had been weak from the start, that the credibility issues with the Arvizo family should have been apparent during the investigation, and that the decision to prosecute may have been motivated more by Sneddon's personal history with Jackson than by the strength of the evidence. Sneddon retired from his position a few years later, and the Jackson trial remained a controversial part of his legacy. For Jackson, the acquittal was a legal victory but not a personal one. The trial had taken a severe toll on his health, his finances, and his reputation. He had lost significant weight during the proceedings and had been hospitalized on multiple occasions. The stress of the trial, combined with his long-standing health issues and alleged medication use, left him visibly weakened. Financially, the trial had cost millions of dollars in legal fees, and the damage to his career was significant. Major corporations distanced themselves from him, endorsement deals evaporated, and his ability to perform and record music was severely compromised. He never fully recovered from the trial, either personally or professionally. The trial also had a lasting impact on public perception of Jackson. For his supporters, the acquittal was vindication, proof that the allegations had been false and that Jackson had been the victim of a greedy family and an overzealous prosecutor. For his critics, the acquittal was evidence that wealth and fame can insulate individuals from accountability, that Jackson had used his resources to escape justice. The divide in public opinion remains to this day, with some viewing Jackson as an innocent man who was persecuted, and others viewing him as a guilty man who was acquitted due to prosecutorial failures and the high burden of proof in criminal cases. The legal standards that govern the trial are worth examining in detail. In criminal cases, the prosecution must prove each element of the charged crime beyond a reasonable doubt. This does not mean absolute certainty, but it does mean that the evidence must be strong enough that a reasonable person would have no significant doubt about the defendant's guilt. The defense does not need to present any evidence at all. They can simply argue that the prosecution has not met its burden. In the Jackson trial, the defense chose to present evidence, calling witnesses and introducing documents that contradicted the prosecution's case. This strategy was effective, but it was not strictly necessary. The prosecution's case was weak enough that reasonable doubt existed even without the defense's affirmative case. The issue of character evidence was also significant. In criminal trials, evidence of a defendant's character is generally not admissible unless the defendant puts their character at issue. But evidence of prior bad acts can sometimes be admitted to show a pattern of behavior. In the Jackson trial, the judge allowed the prosecution to introduce evidence from the 1993 case and from other allegations, arguing that it showed a pattern. But the defense successfully argued that these prior allegations were also based on questionable evidence, and that allowing them risked prejudicing the jury against Jackson without providing reliable information. The balance between allowing relevant evidence and preventing unfair prejudice is always delicate in criminal trials, and in the Jackson case, the judge's rulings favored the defense more often than the prosecution. The role of the media in the trial cannot be overstated. The trial was broadcast on television, with legal analysts providing commentary in real time. This created a public spectacle that influenced public opinion, but also put pressure on the participants. Jurors were instructed not to watch media coverage or discuss the case with anyone, but the pervasive nature of the coverage made it difficult to avoid. Some legal experts have argued that the media circus contributed to the prosecution's difficulties, that the public scrutiny made it harder for witnesses to testify honestly, and made the jury more skeptical of sensational claims. Others have argued that the media attention benefited Jackson, that it allowed his supporters to rally and create a narrative of persecution that influenced public perception. The aftermath of the trial saw continued debate about the justice system and its handling of celebrity cases. Some argued that Jackson received special treatment, that an ordinary defendant facing similar charges would have been convicted. Others argued the opposite, that Jackson was targeted precisely because of his fame, that the prosecution pursued a weak case because of public pressure and the desire for a high-profile conviction. The truth is likely that both factors played a role. Jackson's wealth allowed him to hire the best legal defense available, which is an advantage that most defendants do not have. But his fame also made him a target, attracting allegations and scrutiny that an ordinary person might not face. The impact on the Arvizo family after the trial is less well documented. Gavin Arvizo has largely remained out of the public eye, and there is little information about his life after the trial. Some reports suggest that the family faced harassment and threats from Jackson's supporters, that they struggled with the public backlash against them. Others have speculated that the family received financial support from tabloid media in exchange for their story, though this has not been definitively proven. The lack of information about the Arvizos makes it difficult to assess the long-term impact of the trial on them, but it is clear that their lives were profoundly affected by the case and its outcome. The trial also raised questions about how the justice system handles allegations of child abuse. These cases are inherently difficult to prosecute because they often lack physical evidence and rely heavily on the testimony of children, who can be unreliable witnesses. The Jackson trial illustrated the challenges prosecutors face in building a case that meets the beyond a reasonable doubt standard. It also showed the importance of witness credibility and the ways in which a defense attorney can use inconsistencies and credibility issues to create doubt. Some victims' advocates have argued that the high burden of proof in criminal cases makes it too difficult to secure convictions in abuse cases, that it places too much emphasis on the testimony of the victim and not enough on the patterns of behavior exhibited by the accused. Others argue that the high burden of proof is necessary to prevent wrongful convictions, that it protects the innocent, even at the cost of allowing some guilty individuals to go free. In the years since the trial, Jackson's legacy has continued to be debated. He died in 2009, just 4 years after the acquittal, under circumstances that led to another legal case involving his personal physician. After his death, the 2019 documentary Leaving Neverland featured two men, Wade Robson and James Safechuck, who alleged that Jackson had abused them as children. Both men had previously defended Jackson, with Robson even testifying on his behalf during the 2005 trial. Their decision to come forward decades later reignited the debate about Jackson's guilt or innocence. Supporters of Jackson pointed out the inconsistencies in their stories and the fact that they had denied abuse for years. Critics argued that it is common for abuse survivors to deny or minimize their experiences, especially when the abuser is someone they admired or when coming forward would invite public scrutiny. The 2005 trial remains a landmark case in the intersection of celebrity, justice, and public opinion. It demonstrated the power of a skilled defense attorney, the importance of witness credibility, and the challenges of prosecuting cases that rely heavily on testimony rather than physical evidence. It also showed the ways in which media coverage can shape public perception, creating narratives that may or may not align with the evidence presented in court. For those who followed the trial closely, the verdict was not surprising. The prosecution's case had significant weaknesses, and the defense had successfully created reasonable doubt. For those who only followed the headlines, the verdict was shocking, a sign that justice had either been served or denied, depending on one's perspective. The question of whether Michael Jackson was guilty of the crimes he was accused of in 2005 is one that will likely never be definitively answered. The jury found him not guilty, which in the legal sense means that the prosecution did not prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. But not guilty is not the same as innocent, and the acquittal does not erase the troubling aspects of Jackson's behavior or the serious nature of the allegations. What the trial does show is the complexity of the justice system, the difficulty of determining truth in cases where evidence is limited and witnesses are flawed, and the ways in which fame, wealth, and public opinion can influence legal proceedings. It is a case that continues to provoke thought, debate, and reflection on what justice means and how we seek it.